It all started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the sun was too bright, the coffee was too weak, and the world seemed to conspire against you. I woke up to the sound of relentless pounding on my front door. Not the polite kind of knocking that suggests a neighbor needs to borrow a cup of sugar, but the kind that makes you think the house is on fire. Worse, someone has finally come to collect your soul. Groggy and still wrapped in my blanket, I shuffled to the door and swung it open, only to be met with the human embodiment of a migraine. Her name was Margaret, but everyone in the neighborhood called her the Enforcer. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and she wielded her clipboard like a weapon. Her phone was clutched in her other hand, and her mouth was already in motion before I could even process what was happening. "You're in violation," she announced, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. I blinked. "Good morning to you too, Margaret. What exactly am I violating?" Margaret's lips pursed, and she jabbed a manicured finger toward my driveway. "This." I followed her gaze, expecting to see something outrageous like a sinkhole or maybe a small family of raccoons setting up camp. But no, it was just my plain old concrete driveway, with my car parked on it, exactly where a driveway was supposed to be used. "This is a pedestrian walking path," she declared, as if that statement made any sense at all. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. "Margaret, it's my driveway." Margaret's expression hardened. "Not according to HOA regulations. The association has designated this space as an unofficial pedestrian pathway for community use." I let out a laugh, thinking maybe she was testing some new brand of comedy, but her scowl remained frozen in place. "You can't be serious. My driveway is literally on my property. It's on the plot I legally own." Margaret held up her clipboard, flipping through pages like she was revealing some ancient prophecy. "Article 14, Subsection B of the Neighborhood Guidelines states that any open space leading to a shared street can be designated as a community pathway if deemed necessary for pedestrian convenience." "Margaret," I said slowly, "this is my driveway. It leads to my garage. For my car." Margaret sniffed, looking at me like I was a child who just didn't get it. "Well, the HOA board has ruled that it's more practical as a walking path. Homeowners are encouraged to use street parking. I checked with the city records when I bought this house. This driveway is mine. It's not public property." Margaret gave me a tight, smug smile. "But the HOA rules supersede your personal preferences." And just like that, I realized what this was: a power move. A ridiculous, absurd, absolutely insane power move. Margaret wasn't doing this because she truly believed my driveway was a sidewalk. She was doing it because she could. For the next few days, I thought maybe, just maybe, common sense would prevail. But no. It started with one person casually strolling across my driveway, as if it were some scenic hiking trail. Then another. By the weekend, I had a full-blown parade of entitled neighbors treating my driveway like their personal thoroughfare. A guy in a tracksuit decided to start using it as his morning jogging path. A woman with a stroller stopped in the middle to check her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that my car was parked just inches away. Someone even had the audacity to set up a tiny lemonade stand at the edge of my driveway, like they were running a sidewalk business. I tried parking my car in the middle of the driveway to block them, but within hours, Margaret was back at my door, waving a fine in my face. "Obstructing a pedestrian pathway," she recited, shaking her head as if I had personally committed a crime against humanity. "That's a DULA 200 violation." I took the paper from her hand, laughing in disbelief. "You can't fine me for parking in my own driveway." Margaret smirked. "Oh, but I can." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't going to stop. Margaret had decided my driveway was now her kingdom, and she would rather burn down logic itself than admit she was wrong. Fine. If Margaret wanted a pedestrian pathway, I'd give her one she'd never forget. I sat on my porch that evening, watching as the so-called pedestrians continued their ridiculous procession across my driveway. A man in a sweatband was power walking like he was training for the Olympics. A woman in yoga pants held a tiny dog under one arm while scrolling through her phone with the other. Two kids on scooters zipped past, nearly knocking over a guy carrying a tray of iced coffee. It was absolute chaos, and Margaret was low-vying every second of it. I could see her from her window, sipping tea like an EVYL overlord watching her subjects obey her decree. I needed to plan something that wouldn't just fight back, but would make a statement so loud it would shake the very foundation of Margaret's clipboard-wielding empire. That's when it hit me. Wet cement. The kind that takes hours to dry. The kind that would make anyone who dared step onto my driveway deeply regret their life choices. If Margaret wanted this to be a walking path, I was going to make it the most inconvenient, infuriating, impossible walking path she had ever seen. I spent the next day researching city permits. Technically, as the homeowner, I had the right to redo my driveway as long as it met basic safety regulations. There was no rule against laying down fresh cement whenever I pleased. And best of all, nowhere in the HOA bylaws did it say I needed Margaret's approval for it. A legal loophole, the perfect weapon. That night, I made my move. I rented a cement mixer, gathered my supplies, and waited until the neighborhood was quiet. Under the cover of darkness, I got to work. The thick gray mixture poured smoothly over my driveway, covering every inch of the so-called walking path in a fresh, wet surface. I placed a few cones at the edges, making it look semi-official, but deep down, I hoped someone would ignore them. I knew exactly who my first victim would be. Morning arrived, and the moment I heard the first shriek, I knew it had worked. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and was met with a sight so glorious, so beautiful, that I nearly choked on my drink. Margaret was stuck knee-deep in cement. Her shoes had vanished beneath the surface, and her legs were buried in the thick sludge, like she had been consumed by the earth itself. The look on her face was pure, undiluted horror. Her arms flailed as she tried to yank herself free, but every movement only made her sink deeper. A crowd had already started forming. Some of the neighbors were holding back laughter. Others were openly filming. One guy muttered, "I can't believe this is happening," while another simply sipped his coffee like this was the best morning entertainment he had ever witnessed. I took my time strolling up to her, savoring the moment. "Oh no, Margaret," I said, feigning concern. "Did you not see the signs?" Her face was a shade of red I had never seen before. "This is sabotage," she screeched. I gestured to the freshly laid cement. "No, this is me improvising my driveway. Completely within my homeowner rights, I might add." Margaret's eyes darted around, looking for support, but even her usual HOA cronies weren't rushing to help her. One of them actually had the audacity to chuckle. She tried to pull out her phone, presumably to call for backup, but in her panic, she dropped it. The device hit the wet cement and was instantly swallowed whole. The gasps from the crowd were almost musical. Margaret was losing it. "Someone get me out of here," she barked, but no one moved. Finally, one of the neighbors, a man who had clearly been waiting for this moment for years, said, "Shouldn't we wait until it dries? That way, the pathway is safe for everyone." The laughter that erupted nearly knocked me off my feet. Margaret, however, was fuming. "I'll have you all fined," she spat, but it was clear her power was slipping. Eventually, someone did help her out, but by the time she was free, she was covered in cement up to her knees, her once pristine clothes ruined. She stomped off without another word, but I knew this wasn't over. Margaret was not the type to admit defeat. If anything, this was only going to make her double down. The next day, my prediction came true. Margaret was back at my door, a fresh fine in her hand, her face still carrying traces of cement. "This is an unauthorized obstruction," she seethed, showing the paper at me. "You are in direct violation of HOA safety standards." I took the fine and slowly ripped it in half right in front of her. "Margaret, do you know what's funny? I actually checked with the city. This is 100 fan tram legal." Her eye twitched. "The HOA will hear about this." I shrugged. "Oh, they already have. In fact, they had front row seats." Margaret turned to see several neighbors watching from their porches, barely holding back their amusement. She clenched her jaw so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. With nothing left to say, she stormed off, slamming her clipboard against her thigh like a disgraced coach whose team had just lost the championship. But I knew Margaret wasn't done. She had been humiliated, and Margaret was the kind of person who would rather set the whole neighborhood on fire than admit she was wrong. She would come back stronger, more desperate, and that meant I had to be ready. The war had only just begun. Margaret wasn't the type to take humiliation lightly. I knew she would be plotting something, and I was right. The very next morning, I found an official-looking letter from the HOA stuffed into my mailbox. The paper was crisp, the font aggressive, and the wording designed to instill fear. It stated that my newly cemented driveway was in violation of community aesthetic standards and needed to be removed immediately. The letter was signed by none other than Margaret herself, acting as the HOA president. I chuckled as I read it. She was trying to hit back, but she had made one fatal mistake. The HOA didn't actually have any real authority to demand something like this. Sure, they could suggest changes, but legally, my driveway was mine to do with as I pleased. Margaret, in all her self-importance, had assumed that her usual scare tactics would work on me. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't like the others who lived in fear of her clipboard and passive-aggressive memos. I decided to make things more interesting. Instead of responding to the letter, I did the opposite of what she wanted. I had my driveway repaved with an even smoother, shinier coat of cement. I made sure it was perfect, seamless, and pristine, exactly the opposite of what Margaret had accused it of being. Then, for good measure, I installed a small but very clear sign at the entrance that read, "Private property." Not a walking path, but feel free to test the cement again. That was when Margaret truly lost it. The next time I saw her, she was fuming, pacing up and down the sidewalk in front of my house like a caged tiger. She was muttering to herself, gripping her clipboard so hard that her knuckles turned white. I knew she was trying to come up with another way to retaliate, but I had backed her into a corner. She couldn't find me again for something that was already proven legal. She couldn't force me to change my driveway. And worst of all, she had lost face in front of the entire neighborhood. But Margaret was nothing if not persistent. Late that night, I was woken up by the sound of scraping metal and an engine rumbling outside. I got up, walked to the window, and what I saw made me laugh in disbelief. Margaret had hired a small construction crew. They were standing near my driveway, one of them holding a clipboard while another revved up a machine that looked suspiciously like a jackhammer. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and stepped outside. The moment Margaret saw me, she put on the fakest, most insincere smile I had ever seen. "Oh, good evening," she said, as if this was just a casual neighborhood visit. I gestured to the crew. "Planning some late-night home improvements?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "The HOA has decided that your driveway is still not compliant with community standards, so we've taken the liberty of arranging for its removal." I stared at her. "Let me get this straight. You're actually going to destroy my driveway without my permission in my property?" Margaret clasped her hands together, tilting her head like I was the unreasonable one. "Well, technically, it's not your property when it disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony." I held up my phone, making sure she saw that I was recording. "You do realize this is trespassing and property damage, right?" Her expression faltered for just a second before she recovered. "No, this is HOA enforcement." I turned my camera toward the construction workers. "And you guys know that if you touch my driveway, you're legally liable, right?" The workers hesitated. One of them, clearly the super VY sore, frowned and looked at Margaret. "Wait, we have homeowner approval for this, right?" Margaret's eye twitched. "I am the HOA president. That's approval enough." The super VY sir didn't look convinced and said, "Ma'am, that's not how this works. We need the actual homeowner's consent before we do anything." Margaret huffed, clearly furious that her plan wasn't working. "This is a community matter. He's obstructing a designated pedestrian path." I cut her off. "Do I need to call the cops?" The workers took a step back. One of them muttered, "Yeah, we're out," before motioning for his team to pack up. Margaret's face twisted in frustration as her grand plan crumbled in real time. She stood there, speechless, as the crew left without even unloading their equipment. I lowered my phone. "You done now, Margaret?" She didn't answer. She just turned on her heel and stormed away, her footsteps sharp against the pavement. The next morning, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting. Word had spread fast about what Margaret had tried to pull, and most of the board members were furious. They had tolerated her tyranny for too long, and after years of excessive fines, unreasonable rules, and blatant power trips, this was the final straw. At the meeting, Margaret tried to spin the story in her favor, claiming I had threatened community safety and that she was just trying to uphold the HOA's integrity. But the neighbors weren't buying it. One after another, residents came forward, sharing their own stories of how Margaret had harassed them over minor things. Mailboxes being the wrong shade of beige, grass growing half an inch too long, a holiday wreath staying up a day past her acceptable decoration period. It was a complete takedown. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her as president, effective immediately. Margaret was done. She didn't take it well. For days, she sulked, avoiding eye contact with the neighbors, refusing to even step outside. And then, just like that, she was gone. One morning, a moving truck showed up in front of her house. By the afternoon, she had packed up and left without a word. The neighborhood, freed from its dictator, slowly came back to life. People started decorating their houses however they wanted. Wind chimes returned. Backyard parties lasted past 8 p.m. Even the guy with the purple mailbox finally got to keep it without receiving daily threats. As for me, I enjoyed my Tory with a cold beer on my porch, looking out at my perfectly intact driveway. The sign I had put up still stood proudly, a final reminder of everything that had happened. A neighbor walked by and gave me a nod. Best thing that's ever happened to this neighborhood. I raised my bottle in agreement. And with that, peace was finally restored. Margaret's departure marked the end of an era, but it also served as a reminder that sometimes, standing up to bullies is the only way to reclaim what's rightfully yours. The driveway war had been a battle of wills, a clash between one man's right to his property and one woman's insatiable need for control. In the end, justice prevailed not through violence or aggression, but through wit, determination, and a well-timed batch of wet cement. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over my quiet, peaceful neighborhood, I couldn't help but smile. The driveway was mine again, and no one, not Margaret, not the HOA, not anyone would ever take it from me. This expanded version of the story adds more depth to the characters, introduces new twists, and builds a more engaging narrative while staying true to the original premise. It's a tale of resilience, cleverness, and the triumph of the underdog. Vyett teep fan ka trien va ko fan ket /. Certainly. Let's continue the story and bring it to a satisfying conclusion. We'll delve deeper into the aftermath of Margaret's departure, explore how the neighborhood evolves, and tie up any loose ends. Here's the continuation and conclusion of the driveway war. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive cloud of HOA tyranny had lifted, and people began to rediscover the joy of living in a community where individuality was celebrated rather than stifled. The once sterile streets now buzzed with colorful garden decorations, kids playing freely, and neighbors chatting over fences without fear of being fined for unauthorized social gatherings. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. A small faction of Margaret's loyalists, mostly those who had benefited from her reign of micromanagement, still lingered. They grumbled about the decline of standards and whispered about how the neighborhood was becoming chaotic. Yet, without Margaret's iron fist to enforce their complaints, their voices were little more than background noise. As for me, I enjoyed my newfound freedom. My driveway remained pristine, the cement now fully dried and polished to a mirror-like finish. The sign I had installed, private property, not a walking path, became a symbol of defiance, a reminder to everyone that sometimes you have to fight for what's yours. The HOA board held an emergency election to replace Margaret. To everyone's surprise, the new president wasn't one of the usual suspects. It was Linda, a soft-spoken retired teacher who had always been a voice of reason during Margaret's reign. Linda's first act as president was to call a town hall meeting to discuss the future of the neighborhood. "I know the last few years have been challenging," Linda began, addressing the crowd gathered in the community center. "But I believe it's time for us to move forward. The HOA should exist to serve the community, not control it. Let's work together to create a neighborhood where everyone feels welcome and respected." The room erupted into applause. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like it belonged to the people, not the other way around. Just when it seemed like peace had been restored, a rumor began to circulate. Margaret was planning a comeback. Some claimed they had seen her driving through the neighborhood late at night, her car slowing as it passed certain houses. Others said she had been spotted at city council meetings, lobbying for stricter HOA regulations. I didn't want to believe it. Margaret had been humiliated, her power stripped away. What could she possibly hope to achieve by returning? But then, one evening, As I was enjoying a quiet dinner on my porch, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of my driveway, her clipboard in hand, staring at the sign with a look of pure disdain. "Margaret," I said, stepping outside. "What are you doing here?" She turned to me, her eyes cold and calculating. "I've been thinking about our little disagreement," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "And I've come to the conclusion that you've been misinformed about the HOA's authority." I crossed my arms. "Oh, really? Enlighten me." Margaret smirked. "You see, while the HOA may not have the power to force you to change your driveway, the city does. And it just so happens that I've been working with the zoning board to reclassify certain areas of the neighborhood, including your driveway, as public pathways." My stomach dropped. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" she said, pulling a folded document from her clipboard. "This is a draft proposal for the rezoning. Once it's approved, your driveway will no longer be private property. It will belong to the city and the HOA. I snatched the document from her hand and scanned it. It was real. Margaret had been busy, and she had found a way to strike back where it hurt the most. I knew I couldn't let this happen. If Margaret's proposal went through, not only would I lose my driveway, but the entire neighborhood would be at risk of losing their autonomy. I had to act fast. I called a meeting with Linda and the rest of the HOA board. "Margaret's trying to rezone the neighborhood," I explained, showing them the document. "If she succeeds, we'll all be at the mercy of the city and her." Linda frowned. "This is serious. But we can't fight this alone. We need the support of the entire neighborhood." And so we mobilized. Flyers were distributed, social media groups were created, and a petition was circulated. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight for their homes. The city council meeting was packed. Margaret sat at the front, her usual smug expression firmly in place. But as one resident after another stood up to speak against the rezoning proposal, her confidence began to waver. "This isn't about driveways or pathways," Linda said during her speech. "This is about our right to live in our homes without fear of being controlled by those who seek power for power's sake." When it was my turn to speak, I held up the sign from my driveway. This sign isn't just a warning. It's a symbol of what happens when we stand up for ourselves. Margaret tried to take my driveway, but she failed. And if we stand together, she'll fail again. The council voted unanimously to reject the rezoning proposal. Margaret's plan had been defeated. Defeated and humiliated once again, Margaret left the meeting without a word. She didn't return to the neighborhood. Rumor had it she moved to a new city, far away from the people who had finally stood up to her. As for the neighborhood, it continued to thrive. The HOA, under Linda's leadership, became a force for good, organizing community events and fostering a sense of unity that had been missing for years. Months later, as I sat on my porch enjoying the sunset, I reflected on everything that had happened. The driveway war had been more than just a battle over property. It had been a fight for freedom, for individuality, and for the right to live without fear. A car pulled up to the curb, and a young couple got out. They were new to the neighborhood, and I could see the excitement in their eyes as they looked around. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, raising my glass in a toast. "You're going to love it here." As they walked up the driveway, I couldn't help but smile. It was mine, and it always would be. The final sign. The sign still stands at the edge of my driveway, a reminder of the battle that was fought and won. But I've added a new line to it, one that sums up everything I've learned. Private property, not a walking path, but always a path to freedom. And with that, the story of the driveway war came to an end, a story of resilience, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.